The war in Ukraine upended all aspects of daily life for Ukrainians, journalists included. In a matter of days, the Kyiv Independent newsroom went from being a 3-month-old startup with just about 30,000 visits per week to one of the world's most important on-the-ground sources for the war in Ukraine, with millions of followers. My guest today, Alexander Carey, is a French reporter working for the Kyiv Independent. He joins me now for perspective. It's worth mentioning that he's also just participated in a recently published book on the Ukrainian resistance. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So the English language wing of the Kyiv Independent opened up as a startup, like I mentioned, in 2021. What was the transformation like to essentially become a full-blown war newsroom?
Well, I mean, the transformation, I wouldn't say was expected, but I mean, it didn't really change much in our way of working, right? Because we already had the ethics that we're using today during the wartime. Because basically, we were built into this idea that we should be as efficient as possible with as little means as we have as possible.
And what about questions of security? Because I imagine having to deploy journalists and reporters to the field where there's active combat happening is not necessarily easy to do from one day to the next.
Well, basically, I think what's important to understand is every journalist who wants to go to the front line first does it, I wouldn't say by himself, but let's say it's a volunteer thing. And then our editor-in-chief, Olga Rudenko, basically allows it or not, considering and taking into account how intense the fightings are somewhere.
Okay, so just to turn to you quickly, you're the only French journalist, in my understanding, at the Kyiv Independent. How did you end up there, and why did you decide to stay?
Well, I started my career in Ukraine in 2016. I worked three years in Ukrainian TV. Then I worked for Kyiv Post, and basically when the Kyiv Post, I wouldn't say shut down, but shut us down, i.e. fired us, we created the Kyiv Independent.
And they fired you over issues of independence?
Of independence, indeed. We were trying to defend the idea that we shouldn't follow the line of one wannabe oligarch, but rather follow, as I said earlier, the ethics of journalism.
The Kyiv Independent, are you guys reporting on anything other than the war at this point?
We're beginning to, because, well, after 3 months of war, I mean, the economy is ongoing, and of course, the amount of money that's going to pour in the country implies that we have to keep an eye on where the money is going, right? So that's why we're setting up an investigative team to, make and keep people accountable of where this money is going.
I imagine for many journalists in the newsroom, the war is obviously something that's very personal. I imagine people have family members, friends affected across the country. How does this affect the coverage? Do you think that there's the risk that war fatigue will set in for something that's so deeply personal for so many people?
I wouldn't call it war fatigue, but in the book, my colleague Anna talks about it. So she had her family evacuated from Bucha, for example, and she had a really hard time writing about Bucha because it's so personal, right? And there's always a point where when you leave somewhere, it gets so personal that you cannot write about something. And it's only fair, and I think it's only fair, and it only goes to also the ethics of journalism, where you just stop and you say to yourself and also to your boss, well, I can't write about it because it gets too personal, and I need a bit of time to write about it. But again, it's also about respecting your own ethics and the ethics of journalism.
Speaking of the ethics of journalism, you contributed to this recently published book, then, War Diary from the Ukrainian Resistance. In the preface, the editors say that informing is resisting. Do you see journalism then in the context of this war as a political act more than just an informative one?
I would call it a political act in a rather global sense, in a rather metaphysical sense, as a way of taking part in a society and building up a society where, as I said earlier, keeping tabs on the future of society is fundamental.
Do you think that how easy or difficult has it been to stay neutral throughout the war? Do you think that it's instead relativized the concept of neutrality as a journalist reporting on such a difficult thing to cover?
I guess journalists should try and reach to objectivity. Now, neutrality is always a difficult concept to grasp, even if you're not on a war front or. or anywhere. I think it's just the idea again is respecting this chart, and dealing with your own faith and your own opinion is something else.
Do you spend time covering any potential abuses by the Ukrainian side, or is that something that's...
No, we do, and every time they are, we do, because it would be hypocritical if we wouldn't, right? So, and that's what I was talking about when it comes to ethics. I think it's only fair if we don't, we can hardly call ourselves journalists.
Why the decision to, because this started, obviously, the Kyiv Independent started in 2021, so before the war. Why did you have the decision to have a Ukrainian newspaper in English?
Because at the time, that's what was lacking, really, and there's a lot of really, really good Ukrainian newspaper in Ukrainian, and it's kind of a niche, but as you see, it's kind of a massive niche, so that's what we needed to do.
Do you have a lot of readership in Ukraine too, or are you mostly targeting international audiences?
We do have a lot of readership in Ukraine, but I don't have the figures in my head at the moment.
You say also in this book that you're not a war journalist, but a journalist in times of war. In reality, though, do you think the lines between these two theoretically very different roles has been blurred?
It has been blurred because, like, when the war comes to you, you can hardly do the difference, right? Because it permeates your entire life, really. So you learn to live with it, and you learn to do your job like you're on a constant front line, really.
Maybe you could talk about, for our readers who don't speak French and who won't be able to read at least this first version of your book, some of the most striking testimonies for you that you think best tell the tale of what you guys have been going through since the start of the war.
Well, I would say most of them, really. But if I can hardly pick one, because most of them, and all my colleagues are incredibly talented. So picking just one wouldn't be fair. So I would say just wait for the English version.
Okay. You think there's going to be an English version?
There's going to be an English version.
Oh, great.
There's
okay.
going to be an English
That's great
version.
to know.
Yeah.
And so perhaps as a last question, what do you see as being in the future for the Kyiv Independent newsroom? Do you think that you will expand? What are the plans?
We will expand indeed, and we will survive the war, and we will survive also the reconstruction. So we will just change topics, obviously, but we'll be here after.
You're optimistic then about Ukraine's fate.
Yes.
Alexander Kerry, thank you so much for coming on the show today. That's all we have time for today, but as a reminder to our viewers, the Kyiv Independent War Diary of the Ukrainian Resistance will theoretically be available in English in due time.